Hello, and welcome to episode 41 of Uncovering the Corners of the World podcast. I'm your host, Karina Kosmala. Using research and my personal experiences where I actually set foot in some of these places, I'll be describing some of the unknown attractions in both the US and around the world. We're back in Kentucky this week as we walk through the historical town of Bardstown. The last time we were in Kentucky, we visited the Creation Museum and Noah's Ark before walking through Oscar Getz' Museum of Whiskey History. Bardstown doesn't just hold the title for bourbon capital of the world. It's also known by being the most beautiful small town in America. Its 300 historical buildings are listed on the National Register of Historical Places. Our first stop on this historical tour through Bardstown is to the Civil War Museum. The Civil War Museum houses the largest collection of Civil War artifacts. It's located at 310 East Broadway Street, Bardstown, Kentucky, in the state that actually didn't take either side in the Civil War. Kentucky declared its neutrality in the war and tried to stick with it. Kentucky produced tobacco, corn, wheat, flax, and hemp, and had the Ohio River pass through the state, which would control the way the troops moved and the resources for the Confederacy. However, both sides didn't pay too much attention to Kentucky's declaration, because the Union tried getting soldiers from Kentucky to join their side without asking if they can actually do that, and the Confederacy entered the state and took over towns, temporarily. Inside the Civil War Museum, each room depicts a part of the Civil War, through the clothing, weaponry, key figures, and important battles of the Civil War. This includes the historical tensions between families where one brother would fight on the Confederacy side and the other brother would fight on the Union side. There are also exhibits such as musical instruments that the band played and exhibits that show the surgical instruments that were used by medical staff during the war. There's also a submarine that was used by the Confederates to destroy the Union blockade gunboat. The submarine carried a torpedo filled with 135 pounds of black powder. The interesting part of this history is that the submarine destroyed the Union gunboat, but it disappeared and was found in 1995, 131 years later. Adjacent to the Civil War Museum is Old Bardstown Village, or Pioneer Village, a town with wooden lodges and houses from the 18th and 19th century. A gravel path guides you through each lodge and house filled with artifacts that describe the first westward movement of the nation. The lodges and houses on the site include a watermill, a blacksmith shop, a church, and a tavern specifically called Captain Bean's Tavern. Some of them have illustrations chronicling the process of making whiskey. Other lodges have machines such as the homemade whiskey still, or machines used for woodworking. One of the homes holds clothing and a headdress of Native Americans, along with a map of all the Native American tribes in the United States. On a hilltop not too far from the Civil War Museum is the General Hall Moore Military Museum at 204 East Broadway Street, Bardstown, Kentucky. Lieutenant General Hall Moore served in the U.S. Army, Vietnam, and Korean War. His book, We Were Soldiers Once and Young, was turned into the 2002 film We Were Soldiers, starring Mel Gibson, that described the Battle of La Drang. The Battle of La Drang took place on November 14, 1965, up until November 18, 1965, in the La Drang Valley, bordering Cambodia, during the Vietnam War. General Hall Moore led the 1st Battalion of the 7th Cavalry between the U.S. and North Vietnamese. The attacks took place at two different landing zones, known as X-Ray and Albany. Landing zones are terms used to explain the place where an aircraft can land. This battle was known to be the first to use helicopters, or they were called airmobiles, to conquer the rugged land. It was also the first major battle of the Vietnam War. The United States declared the battle a victory, even though 545 Americans were killed, while 800 North Vietnamese were killed at the landing zone at X-Ray, and 403 were killed in the landing zone at Albany. At the General Hall Moore Military Museum, there are pathways that take visitors through each war that the United States was a part of, all the way through the recent events of the United States flying all of the soldiers from Afghanistan on August 30th, 2021. The museum exhibits feature flags, uniforms, and weaponry during different time periods. Some specific items include Confederate Brigadier General Lloyd Tillman's presentation sword, along with a silver flask. The museum also honors Julie Moore, the wife of General Hall Moore, who worked with the U.S. Army to create a survivor support network and delivered information to the families of the soldiers who died in the war. Walk from the General Hall Moore Military Museum to a museum that details the impact and the roles that women had during the Civil War. The Women's Civil War Museum is located at 204 East Broadway Street in Bardstown, Kentucky, in the Wright Talbot House. Historically, 400 women took part in the Civil War, where they dressed as men in order to fight in the Union and Confederate armies. Women's involvement in the Civil War included serving as spies, writers, nurses, administrators, and soldiers during the war. One of the female spies during the Civil War was Rose O'Neal Greenhow, who worked as a spy for the Confederates, where she passed along information from politicians and diplomats to the Confederate General P.G.T. Beauregard. One of the ways she passed along the information about future attacks from the Union was by placing coded messages in Beatty Duval, a 16-year-old who delivered the message to Confederate General P.G.T. Beauregard. Another female spy was Harriet Tubman, who organized black men to be disguised as servants and slaves to gather information from the Confederates. She also freed 700 slaves in July of 1863. The museum features dresses that women wore during that time period, along with portraits and photographs of the women and a sewing machine. All these museums can be visited in a day, and if you buy one ticket. Thank you for listening to this week's episode. If you want to read more about the Civil War Museum and the old Bardstown Village Civil, check out the website bardstownmuseumrow.org and the article The Crittenden Brothers and the American Civil War in Kentucky. The website visitbardstown.com also explains the history of Bardstown. If you're interested in learning more about the General Hall Moore Military Museum, check out the article General Hall Moore Dies, Life Depicted in Randall Wallace, Mel Gibson's film We Were Soldiers, written by Anita Bush, along with the website Parks and Travel Magazine on the Hall Moore Military Museum. There is also the longer detailed history of the Battle of La Grange on the website DefensePOW/MIA Accounting Agency. If you're interested in learning more about the Women's Civil War Museum, check out the website Bardstown Museum Row and check out the website history.com to read more about the female spies in the Civil War in the article Secret Agents in Hoop Skirts, Women Spies of the Civil War. Have a great weekend.